For everyone with an interest in MASH or, more broadly, steatotic liver disease, surf's up. Surfing the MASH Tsunami's annual year-end interviews with some of the people who made a difference in the mausald world in 2023, Season 4, Episode 50 plus, starts now.
Today on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
The success or the positive data that's coming out of clinical trials is very supportive. And one reason why we believe so strongly in those outcomes is, of course, that digital pathology underlines those histopathological reads done by pathologists.
We have seen such a huge steatosis reduction, from multiple drugs. Like in multiple weeks, you can see a 30, 50, 70% drop relative change of MRI-PDFF. We know fibrosis does not resolve in the same time frame. It takes much longer for fibrosis to go away. One thing we did is really try to unmask what's the impact of such a rapid drop in steatosis and later on liver volume on fibrosis.
When we put people on diets that lose rapid weight loss, when I see that in the real world now, I can see that in weeks in a FibroScan and steatosis levels. Think about the person involved in this. They feel better, they feel lighter, they think clearer. And is that purely fat reduction? Is that volume reduction? Is it a combination of both? Where do we align with what makes the patient feel better? That would be interesting to correlate with some of the data that's coming out.
One thing we also see in this fibrosis, and especially in this metabolic disease, is that there's always an underlying progression driver. While you take on all these drugs, unlike hepatitis C, the underlying fibrosis driver did not go away. So what we end up seeing is that you always have fibrosis and fibrolysis coexist.
As a momentous year in steatotic liver disease comes to an end, the Surfing the MASH Tsunami team is reviewing the year with some of our favorite guests. Today, hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Jörn Schattenberg, liver health advocate Louise Campbell, and pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green interview HistoIndex Chief Scientific Officer Dean Tai about advances in AI analytics and insights in 2023 on the Surfing the MASH Tsunami podcast.
So our fourth interview in this year-end series of at least 9 and still growing interviews on our podcast is with Dean Tai, Chief Scientific Officer at HistoIndex. It's always fun interviewing Dean, number one, because his time is divided between Singapore and Australia, both of which are really fascinating if you live here and you have colleagues in Europe. And right now, I guess it's 8 in the morning here. So what time is it, Singapore, Dean?
Now it's 9 p.m.
9 p.m., which is an entirely reasonable hour for everybody. And somewhere in the middle, we have Louise and Jörn, for whom it's mid-afternoon and just delightful. Jörn, how are you this afternoon?
I'm fine. 2 p.m. for me. This day of the week, I'm back in Mainz for an audit, something I had to take care of, but back and forth between places a lot, or more time in homework these days. But that's one time zone, so that's the good news.
That sounds easy, relatively speaking. And Louise, how are you this afternoon?
I'm very well. It's 1 p.m. for me. As Dean probably knows, I split my time between London and Perth, which is the same time zone as Singapore.
And Louise, is Mark still in the UK?
Yeah, we're here for Christmas and New Year.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, because Louise spends a bunch of time with her husband in Australia and her there, so she lives a dual timeline kind of life in many different ways. Me, I'm just in the eastern US. It's kind of boring, but it's good. So, okay, let's just kick this off. One good thing personal that's happened in each that we have to be thankful for, or that's happened in each of our lives in 2023. Dean, I'm going to ask you to go first because you only have to think of one, and we have to think of one for every conversation.
So personally, I'm very thankful. This is actually, for me, one of the first year post-COVID. So I started to go to all these in-person meetings. Because on Asia, we're a bit slow in terms of all this opening. But I got to say, I miss all these in-person meetings. It's a lot of travel, but nothing beats the face-to-face interaction. And you feel like you're really back in the family, when you meet the people and then you talk to them and you actually get to shake their hands. So I think this is great. I'm glad things are back to nearly where it used to be, but the air tickets and hotels are a lot more expensive.
Yeah, that is a problem. It's true, particularly the airfares. Although we have the option in the States of flying a whole bunch of airlines that don't charge you very much money but never take off on time, and you keep thinking that the propellers are held together with rubber bands. So if you want to save money, you can do that. It changes from a flight into like a horror ride, and you hope that they're not doing any loops. Okay, Jörn, Louise, who has a good thing they want to share next?
I'll jump in. I suppose it was my wedding anniversary last week. So we did our annual trip to the Ritz for lunch. Wander down to Winter Wonderland to listen to some live music and sit by a log fire. So that was my one good thing for the week, and something different to what I shared last week.
Halfway different, at least. It's a step in. Now you said we're going to be doing this, and now you said we did this. It's good. Okay, Jörn, go ahead.
Yeah, well, my personal highlight is we picked up our Christmas tree. It's very traditional. We went to the woods, and they're actually selling them in the woods. And my family always picks on me for picking the one that's the squarest and or not straight. And I think this year, again, it's a very individual Christmas tree, and we enjoy it tremendously every year. But we got that one last weekend.
Is that the academic in you goes for the preciseness of a Christmas tree?
Supposedly the ones I'm getting are not straight, so they're always kind of kinky or have too big bottom or whatever, and they're always a little individual.
So, Jörn, does that speak to the creative approach that you take to all the hepatology projects you deal with every day?
Well, that's what I claim every time, right? You put some lining on them and they always look nice.
So, okay, I'll go with that one. Jews don't have Christmas trees, but our son and daughter-in-law do not practice Judaism, and they're not raising our granddaughter Jewish. So we get to watch their debate over their tree every year. And we were with them yesterday, and the debate was, this one's lower than last year's. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. And by the way, that's the version of your debate that I hear every year. And since as best I can tell, they're all within 3 inches of the same height, I think that false precision is just fantastic. So with that, we've had birthdays, air flights, and Christmas trees. And let's go on. So, Dean, just to kick off, 2023 was a big year, I think, for all of us in many different ways. But overall, what's your impression of the year? How do you feel at the end of 2023 about Mazel or Nafeld or whatever you want to call it? We'll go with Mazel because everybody else is. And what we've learned and where we've come in the past 12 months.
The biggest news for us all is that there's going to be drug approved. Okay, I think this is very encouraging news. We started to see positive outcome results along and not just one drug, multiple studies showing promising results this year. So I think this is a great year for us all. Now, for HistoIndex, I think for us is that we see that the entire digital pathology field taking off. I think is that with all this positive outcome results, we actually have convincing data to present to FDA. We always have this chicken and egg problem with FDA. Like, you have to show us something that's from a proven drug while we were helping drugs getting approved. So we're always back to this chicken and egg. Now, another highlight for us is that we are getting a lot of data linking to long-term clinical outcome. We presented some in EASL this year. We're getting a lot more we're getting the data in. So these are very exciting times for putting the pieces together. So I think we have a great time for 2024 where we actually can present the ultimate data linking digital pathology to long-term clinical outcome. I think the entire field should be excited that we have this data can help move the drug development forward.
First of all, obviously, all that makes sense. Jörn, do you have a comment or follow-up on that, since we're kind of over in your neighborhood right now? You're in academic neighborhood right now?
Again, I think we had that in previous interviews. I'm aligned with Dean here. I think that the success or the positive data that's coming out of clinical trials is very supportive. And one reason why we believe so strongly in those outcomes is, of course, that digital pathology underlines those histopathological reads done by pathologists. So, using multiple approaches, looking at histology, which has its flaws, we're able to produce robust improvements in those histological endpoints that are important. And then in addition, generate additional interesting structural changes that we haven't assessed, using the NAS, the CRN. So I'm fully aligned with Dean here. I think it's a very interesting field. And of course, linking long-term outcome is going to be crowned to it.
So I'm going to fully align with you because I like that phrase. I think that the structural changes and what we're starting to learn now are really important, because if you go back to the old metaphor, my old metaphor of thinking about liver disease the way we thought about cancer back in the 1960s and 1970s, it was several years into the research that you really started to understand what made cancer happen and why not all cancers were alike. And the ability, I think, Dean, first of all, and you and I have talked about this, to use digital histopathology to understand what's going on structurally in different parts of the liver will be fantastic, both in terms of our general understanding of the organ and in terms of drug developers' ability to pick targets, and testing and IT people's ability to pick targets and say, this is the thing I want to address, and have some clarity about getting it right. So I agree with that. And my other thought is I tend to think of life in terms of if this were a cartoon, what would the thought bubble over somebody's head say? The thought bubble to me over liver disease about diagnostics always was we have to find a way to do better. And in 2023, it's starting to feel like that's changed from we know ways to do better. We haven't proven it yet to the degree that, say, regulatory agencies want. But I stand with Jörn, and I think everybody else, we all believe that because of digital pathology, we know a lot more about the liver than we did. And I'm going to come back to one example of that you and I have talked about a little later in this conversation. Louise, go ahead.
Just listening, for me, it's exciting. It's not just the aligning with histopathology and the long-term outcomes for liver. It's also about the other long-term outcomes, cardiometabolic, endocrine. The more we can strengthen the data that we've got to say that we do not need a biopsy going forward, the better it's going to be. So if I could do a double backflip somersault, I would be for patients not needing in years to come the amount of biopsies, because we're just driving that data. And I think Dean and his team are sort of forefront and center at giving that data back. For me, it's exciting. It doesn't matter what, as long as we can produce it, we can do it in a patient-friendly way, we can get that engagement. I think the more we get, the better.
So within that context, Dean, can you mention or can you cite specific things that you saw or did or were part of in 2023 that you thought were really big wins and great moments for the muscle ecosystem?
So one thing, because now again we have proven effective drugs. So all along we have seen such a huge steatosis reduction, from multiple drugs. Like in multiple weeks, you can see a 30, 50, 70% drop relative change of MRI-PDFF. So this leads us to start looking into, what happens to fibrosis, because this is the very first time in the world anyone has seen in the liver such a drastic change in fat in such rapid time. We know fibrosis does not resolve in the same time frame. It takes much, much longer for fibrosis to go away. So this created a question. So one thing we did is basically together with Stephen Harrison and other sponsors, including Madrigal, we actually presented this data, really try to unmask what's the impact of such a rapid drop in steatosis and later on liver volume on fibrosis. So this is very exciting because they kind of help us to better understand what's really happening. And then more importantly, how do we use AI and geopathology to help to provide a solution to this kind of question. So along the way, we found other kind of problems like that, and then we help to provide a solution. Now, another exciting part, which is really linking these specific changes to clinical outcome.
So, Dean, but can I say something on the first part? Because I think this is very interesting. I don't want to take away from your summary, but, the one thing you've been saying is how does the pathologist read the fibrosis stage different when the fat goes away? I think this is a fascinating data set here. The machine assesses it, and the pathologist assesses it, and there is a certain optical aspect to that if you have fibers lying closer to each other, where the machine can absolutely quantify it. I think this is one thing. And the other thing is then, and this is something we've been working on, is if you combine that with direct fibrosis markers, looking at some blood-based markers and gain additional granularity on the amount of change of fibrosis burden or fibrogenesis or fibrolysis, if you'd like. So I think that's how I see that question, and that's why I think it's very important to do these type of analyses.
Exactly, because they help us to have a new understanding. The truth is we didn't know about this before these studies, before these trials even come along. So therefore, of course, the development of MIT, we will be kind of blinded to this data. And now with the help with digital pathology, we can actually kind of redesign or better design our NIT approaches. And I think that's where we are now.
Louise, I'm going to let you go before I go because I'm going to shift a little bit.
I was just trying to conceptualize it in a way that I can sort of talk to patients about it as to where we're moving from, how we're moving to, and the sort of rapid weight losses. And it's interesting because, yes, we're maybe seeing this now in trials, but when we put people on diets that lose rapid weight loss, when I see that in the real world now, I can see that in weeks in a FibroScan and steatosis levels. And of course, that can be volumed up quicker than probably going to histopathology and things like that. So I think it's something we do see. I think we see it within bariatric surgery, but the way it affects the volume of the liver and how it affects the person think about the person involved in this, they feel better, they feel lighter, they think clearer. And is that purely fat reduction? Is that volume reduction? Is it a combination of both? Where do we align with what makes the patient feel better? That would be interesting to correlate with some of the data that's coming out, because it's all data rather than now let's put the patient-reported outcomes into that data and see if we can hit other parameters for me, because I deal with the patient end, obviously. So it's explaining it.
So, Louise, do you have a sense of what you will say to a patient in January 2024 about the things we're talking about today? Or are we not far enough along to get there yet?
I don't think we're far enough along there. We need to get, obviously, resmetirom and things into the real-life setting, because I think what we will see is different data coming out of the real-world population that we might not have seen within the trial population. And that will very much affect the information we give, because we know there's a futility to some of these medications. How are we going to predict that? Now, Jörn and ourselves have discussed that on the podcast. We need to know who to take off that medication. So again, these conversations are very much going to develop in real time if we get the right education coming back into allied health and the physicians.
I want to say something. So my approach, speaking to a patient, would be, now that I have a biopsy at baseline, I'm going to redo a biopsy, and we've used a drug that dramatically defattens your liver. We should not be scared if the fibrosis level didn't change in the histological read. We might need additional tests to detect the fibrotic benefit for your individual response, okay? That's something I might want to discuss with a patient, coming back to the observation that sometimes we overstage fibrosis in the NASH CRN system when there's a lot of fat removed from the liver. And Dean, I think it goes kind of that way, and it helps us to have additional tests to underlie the change in fibrosis.
Exactly. So kind of links to my other point, because we have seen data just this year about linking fibrosis resolution to outcome. So what we have seen is that, the fibrosis around central vein region, they link to outcome more than the fibrosis around portal tract regions. Okay. So this is not something surprising to most of the pathologists, because they always know, hypothesize that the unlike hepatitis, viral hepatitis, which really fibrosis started around the portal tract area, in mast cell patients, they actually started and centralized around central vein area. And this is one of the key differentiation in terms of the histopathology between these etiologies. So we know this all along, but this is probably the first time we actually have quantitative and reproducible data, to show something we kind of anticipated. But the implication of this actually is very important for both the drug development and later on the NIT development, because now you need to be able to use different approaches with multiple NIT, not just to measure total collagen resolution. You actually need to pick up specific reduction of certain fibrosis in order to show that these are the changes that are linked to longer term clinical outcome. And one thing we also see in this fibrosis, especially in this metabolic disease, is that there's always an underlying progression driver. While you take on all these drugs, unlike hepatitis C, the underlying fibrosis driver did not go away. So what we end up seeing is that you always have fibrosis and fibrolysis coexist. Okay, so this is another complication. So again, we will need to take this into consideration for both development and MIT, so you can better manage patients, when the question discussed earlier about, when to stop the treatment and how to manage them. And these are the data we need. They just surfaced, and we really need to use the best possible tool like digital pathology to make sure we capture all these subtle changes so we can better plan our management strategy post-drug approval.
Interesting. So, Dean, as I'm listening to this conversation, I'm thinking about a chat you and I had in Boston and some of the work that's emerging from the bariatric research, and I'm going to try to get them in the same frame. One of the comments you made to me in Boston is that with some of the analyses that you do, you actually see a fairly consistent level of placebo response, similar to what Stephen Harrison showed in that one Maestro NASH presentation at about maybe a third of patients. The second is that the bariatric work tells us that we tend not to see fibrosis regression really for 5 years, right? That a 1-year regression count post-bariatric surgery is not a realistic predictor of where you're going to be 4 years later, which says to me there might be a couple of underlying principles to this disease that are A, common if you had to look at them, and B, that regulatory agencies aren't paying attention to. So if you look at fibrosis regression in 1 year, using the criteria that we have right now, you're going to understate placebo effect, and you're going to understate the consistent long-term effect of the drug. So when someone comes on here, as one of our KOLs did last week, and said the biggest problem we're going to have is figuring out what 75% of patients this drug isn't working in, I think that's not the right number, right? The right number should be somewhat lower than that. I mean, it's working in more than a quarter of the patients. It's just that we're not going to know that fast enough yet.
Yes, exactly. So I think one thing we spoke about that is really about the fact you're using fully quantitative approach. Let's narrow the gaps, the step size. That's why instead of quarter, you actually get, I think in the study we show more, slightly over 50% regressive. So that's really a simple reduction of the step size, meaning you use something finer to measure. So your noise level just get reduced. But I think what you just touched on, which is something we presented this AASLD. So what we have found is that there is what I call drug-induced specific fibrosis changes. That means despite the patient is being diagnosed as a progressive or regressive or no change by pathologists basing on a NASH staging, we see that in all treated patients, there are specific fibrosis changes. And we don't see the same fibrosis changes in all the placebo patients. So it seems to suggest that these are drug-induced changes. And it happens in parallel to other, the architecture system that NASH is looking for. So in this case, the drug is not that potent. So the change is not like significant enough to cross what we call the one-stage fibrosis bar. But we see a statistical significant change in all treated cohorts. We see this in multiple studies. So we were trying to put together a profile list based on different mechanisms of actions. But in short, we can differentiate these changes despite the pathologist call the patient, whether it's a regressive patient or progressive patient. So it seems to suggest that, again, these are happening in parallel, that the underlying driver of metabolic disease might not completely go away. And I think this will probably be the case for some drugs later on.
Do you think there'll be cases where the underlying driver does go away? Or do you think it's just the nature of the disease and that'll be true for everybody for all time?
I think it will be a patient-specific. We will never see that across all patients.
Okay.
Were there any other commonalities in that set of patients? For example, were they all postmenopausal women? Or were they a particular sex, ethnic minority, PMPLA3 positive? Was there any other common denominator with that population that could be drawn on?
No, I think that's a great question. I think we're just touching on the surface of this, or we're just, pulling all the placebo together. So I think this will be a very interesting point. And I think that's why 2024 is an exciting time, because now we have the tool and we have the successful trials. So now we can start answering these questions.
So one of the things, I think what you're talking about is amazingly important and shows tremendous potential to learn. And as Louise points out, we can then start to dive, as her question points out, we can start to dive into things like gender and genetics and figure out, okay, what really makes a difference here? And that's fantastic. I'm wondering if there's a way to publicize your findings such that we educate the treating population that they can be more comfortable that their drugs are having an effect. And more to the point, what can you do, or what can we do based on digital pathology to do a better job faster of saying this patient is getting benefit from this drug or not? Because when you get to the economics of treatment, the biggest problem is going to be if I've got to put a patient on a drug for 18 months to prove that 25% are getting what I call efficacy, that's a really dicey proposition economically. Whereas if we can start to demonstrate some patterns of underlying change that you can pick off faster and maybe have a higher response rate, you change the perceived economic of pharmacotherapy pretty much immediately. So what do you think?
Agree. I think this will take two steps. One is really it's still a very technical and kind of complicated statement for patients for sure, and even for investors, so that's one of the problems I have. So I think to be able to show this in a simpler manner and more importantly linked to clinical outcome, I think that's the step one. Step two is really a joint statement, because right now this data is very new, so we really need more data, and more importantly the kind of the consensus opinion about what this data means, because like what you said, the 25% versus 50%, this is really important, and it will be important and also useful that we can show this from more than one study, multiple studies. I think that will also enhance the case.
Yeah, I think actually if we can make the case, it changes the rules. Drug therapy seems less futile, and over time, going back to Louise's question, we can actually start to figure out how to think differently about different patient subpopulations. So fantastic. 2024, other than the obvious, which is the hope for approval of resmetirom, what else do you see coming this year?
So I think, first of all, there will be a lot more data from digital pathology I just mentioned. One thing else, I think it will be also a new interpretation and new data coming from the NITs, because one thing we learned in the past year is that a lot of NIT data is not being done right, the context of use. I think we heard a lot about that from the workshop by FDA in September. So I think that we will also see a reorganization of the NIT approaches. And I hope that 2024 we can, synchronize the development of the biopsy and NIT, because I think one thing right now what's missing is that we are trying to dissociate the two too early. So meaning we shouldn't be doing biopsy and go straight to NIT. And I think that dissociation, I agree that's a long-term angle. There's no doubt about it. But whether are we ready to do that? My personal view is that if we do that too soon, we actually end up hurting the drug development and potentially the NIT development along the way to help us to better use the drug management. So I hope to see this synchronization and embracement of each other in 2024.
Do you think that's a realistic goal to achieve in 2024, or do you see us taking steps down the path in 2024? And if it's the latter, how long do you think it will take to get this to a place where it becomes meaningful in terms of how we think about drugs and patients?
I think with this positive result drugs, actually it will take sooner than we thought, because I would say the most of the data is there, at least the proof of concept data we should be able to obtain from these studies. So I think 2024 will be a proof of concept phase. We will need to design new studies to make sure we have the right data from the patient inclusion step. At this point in our trial design, we simply was not tailored for it. So the data we obtain is not really ideal. Again, at least we can't answer FDA with the data we have. But again, it will be a good proof of concept. So back to your question, I think 2024 will be the starting. And in the next year or two, with more trials with this design in the protocol, I think we should have those results within the next 2 years.
Fantastic. Obviously, that would be a profound breakthrough, but that might understate how profound the breakthrough will be. Louise, any other questions or thoughts for Dean before we go to wrap up?
No, I was enjoying listening to that last summary he was given, because that's exciting. The more we get confirmation of how the non-invasives we'll always get data, and I think we need more. And I think he's right. Are we ready to move to an entirely non-invasive monitoring? No, we certainly don't. We've already discussed we don't have the subdivisions of different population sets, of ethnicity. We are going to get a lot of information in the next 2 years that people will spend their entire careers trying to analyse. We get more data, the more technologically sound we become. I've just doing a set of slides for a presentation reviewing my career in nursing, and it comes from the first subcutaneous pen for insulin. Look where we are now with the monitoring and things like that. So it's amazing what technology brings, but I'm excited. But I totally agree. We're not ready for a completely non-invasive world yet. But it's exciting listening to where it's going.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah. So the other thing is, Roger, this is Jörn. Dean, sorry, I missed some of it because I dropped off temporarily. But speaking of standard diagnostics in clinics, I think we learn a lot for that field too. I mean, this is not all about NASH approval, but also augmentation of, clinical practice in the future, I think. And therefore, it's very valuable that we have augmentative technologies to support histological assessment, which is going to be needed always in differential diagnosing liver diseases and fibrosis stages. So I think, even beyond the clinical trial space, there is a realm for that.
So your question is, when I hear about this, one of the things I think about is monitoring therapy over time, which is we need more precise ways to figure out what's going right and what's going wrong once we've started the patient. And you touched on a few issues around patient management, but it struck me that this might over time become to be the most important one. How do we know if what we're doing is working?
So hopefully we're going to answer that in the absence of liver histology. But you'll be able to we need something like an SVR, sustained virological response, sustained resolution of steatohepatitis score, hopefully through NITs. But in the beginning, to understand it better, we'll correlate it with histology.
I didn't mean to say that everyone's going to need to have liver histology to figure it out. What I meant, I guess, is exactly what you just said, which is that this is the pathway where we will learn how to use NITs to do that and proceed with greater faith faith in the drugs and therapies we have. So, Dean, where you sit, do you see any negative disruptors for 2024, things that could go wrong that we need to keep an eye on, besides the obvious, which is for some reason resmetirom doesn't get approved?
So actually, one thing I kind of worry about histology all along is that if we jump to conclusion too fast, or if we discredit histology, and then just quickly move to NIT, actually, I think there's a terrible move at 2024 because we just start to understand the drug, especially with the promising drug forward. So for me, that's actually a big no, and I think you eventually would do more harm to the field.
Interesting. Louise?
Dean's correct. Whilst we don't like liver biopsy, a good conversation with the patient about why and you're doing it and looking for it always gets you the right results. Patients want the right results. They don't want us to gamble on lack of knowledge and guesswork. And whilst it is not the nicest procedure, it is a procedure that will always be required in individual patients. So we cannot discredit it because we really, really need it. And it's got us to where we are now. It may not be perfect, but nothing in a liver, in an organ that regenerates and has so much new tissue, is ever going to be perfect. And I think we have to accept that.
Louise, if you ask my wife what the 3-word phrase she associates me with most often, the answer is going to be never say never. And the reverse on that is never say always. So I agree with your statement for the foreseeable future, but everything we're looking at now says we should come to a day where we don't need histology to do that. So when you say we'll always need histology, I think in the present, it has purposes that cannot be overlooked even for individual patients. But one of the hopes over time is, in fact, that never say always because it isn't always. Yeah, okay, go ahead, Dean.
No, I'm thinking it's really a proper, workflow. Eventually we want to use everything as right place, and I think we shouldn't do this with bias, thinking, okay, because patients don't like biopsy and immediately we put a bias on that. So it's really eventually, in certain cases, we need it to help us to answer certain questions. And then everything should be data driven. So at this point, I think what we should do is make sure that we get as much data, as high quality data as we can, and then we can together, especially with now the drug coming, we're going to have a lot of new workflows, new guidelines, and I think this is the part where we really need to stay open and then get all this NIT versus biopsy at its rightful place.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's Louise, unless you have anything to add, I think that's a great closing note for this conversation. So Dean, thank you so much for sharing your evening, Louise's afternoon, and my morning with us, and we look forward to talking more in 2024. You know what a big fan I am of the work that you folks do. And as you start to see some of the other AI firms produce work of their own, I think it only becomes more exciting. I think you people push each other to compete harder, and it's also an impressive thing. And Jörn is back in time for a closing comment. So Jörn, closing thought?
Oh, not much more I can say. Again, enjoyed this conversation tremendously. Highly enjoyed working with Dean and HistoIndex in that last year, and very much looking forward to what's coming up for 2024.
And for our listeners, I believe our next conversation tomorrow is going to be with Hannes Hagström from Karolinska Institute. He's been a guest a couple of times this year, but his name has come up in a couple of these interviews already, and he's been given us a prestigious award since the last time we saw him, so it should be a fun conversation. Dean, thank you so much. Listeners, we'll catch up with all you guys again tomorrow. Until then, stay safe and surf on. Thanks.
And now for the Season 4 End-of-Year Episodes Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, Chayim Slava, glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. And also, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live. The last time I recorded a business section for this podcast, the U.S. Congress was delaying getting badly needed aid to Ukraine. The world was decrying the death of Palestinian civilians, while most were forgetting, and even worse, some were celebrating, the horrible rapes, beheadings, and other beastly crimes Hamas committed on innocent Israelis October 7th that precipitated the Israeli military action. I'd love to say that 3 weeks later, things have changed for the better, and there were days of hope in the Middle East during the Israel-Hamas ceasefire. But sadly, little is meaningfully improved. As we come to this holiday season, let's hope the Ukrainian military maintains and perseveres through the coming winter, and that we can find a solution in the Middle East that preserves an Israel that does not have to fear its neighbors and allows a Palestinian people who live next to them to find peace and prosperity and pursue a better quality of life for their families and themselves. Slava Ukraini, Am Yisrael Chai.
Congratulations, Jörn, and welcome back.
Last time we met, it was too soon to announce Professor Schattenberg's promotion to department head at the medical school in Saarland. Well, that's official now. Jörn has assumed his new responsibilities, and he will be with us on a more or less regular basis going forward. We may need to work a bit on how to improve his internet speed and reliability when staying overnight in Hamburg. I'm sure we'll work that out.
Hey, Spotify, thanks for the good news.
Last week, we received from Spotify their wrap-up numbers from 2023. What these numbers told us was that we had more growth this year than we had anticipated. 50% more listeners, 11% more streams, 72% of people listening doing so for the first time, and if we extrapolate up from Spotify's share of our entire listener pool, 3,000 listeners who rate us in their top 10 podcasts, 2,000 rating us in their top 5, and 750 rating us their overall top. Those are bigger numbers than we thought we had, and we're excited to know that so many people are gaining benefit from this podcast.
You will see new graphics and a new email address when we all return in 2024.
In the interest of efficiency and recognition of Eric's increasingly demanding schedule, we decided to execute the entire graphic and website cutover to MASH Tsunami. All will be fixed when we come back in the beginning of the new year.
The vault is closed for 2023.
Historically, we've included neither Vault conversations nor business sections during the year-end interview series. No more Vault this year as well, but there are a few business section comments I want to share. These may change during the interview week or not. If they change, we'll let you know. And that's it for the year. I want to thank our team, Jörn, Louise, Jake, Mike, Eric, Steve, for their work throughout the year, and more important, to thank you, the listeners, who stuck with us throughout. We've got more interviews ahead, and after that, we'll be back early in January with a new year of episodes and perhaps some new features as well. Until then, enjoy the holiday. Happy 2024. And as always, stay safe and surf on. Bye-bye now.
Join us tomorrow when our interview partner will be hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Professor Hannes Hagström.